Wednesday, January 2nd, 1935, was already set to be an eventful day in the United States. In Flemington, New Jersey, the long-anticipated trial of the century began with jury selection. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant, stood accused of kidnapping and murdering Charles Lindbergh's infant son. Lindbergh became an American icon and the most famous person in the world in 1927 after he completed the first solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean, and the ordeal with his son etched his name into history for a second time. More than 1,000 miles to the west, in Kansas City, Missourians clamored for fresh headlines in the papers and updates on the radio. They couldn't wait to hear the sensational developments of the trial, but they would soon find themselves distracted by a mystery right in their backyards. Just before 1:30 that afternoon, on January 2nd, a man walked into the President Hotel located on Baltimore Avenue. He had dark brown hair, thick eyebrows, and a face that made it difficult to pinpoint his age. Some claimed he looked 15, others said 25, and even more said 35. He had two distinct physical blemishes. First, there was a large horizontal scar on the side of his head that he tried to cover with his haircut. Second, he had cauliflower ear in his left ear. Those who saw the man figured he was likely a wrestler or a boxer. The man approached the front desk and requested a room for the night. He specifically wanted an interior room, that is, a room facing the hotel's courtyard, not the street. The hotel clerk assigned him room 1046. When asked to sign the register, the man wrote the name Roland T. Owen from Los Angeles, California. Roland met the bellhop, Randolph Probst. Randolph quickly noticed that Roland didn't have any luggage, no suitcase, no briefcase, no nothing. All Roland seemed to have was what he was wearing, a nice suit and a black overcoat. Roland and Randolph walked to the elevator and told the operator to take them to the 10th floor. As they ascended, the guest and the bellhop chatted. Roland mentioned that he had stayed at the nearby Mulebach Hotel the night before, but he decided to change hotels because the Mulebach wanted to charge him a shocking $5 for a room. That would be $115 today, and that was too rich for Roland's blood. When they reached the 10th floor, Randolph showed Roland to his room 1046. Randolph unlocked the door and took Roland inside. Roland seemed satisfied. As it turned out, Roland did have a few items on him. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a tube of toothpaste, a comb, and a hairbrush. He laid them on a shelf above the sink in the bathroom. With nothing left to do, Randolph and Roland exited the room. Randolph locked the door and handed Roland the key. Both men hopped back into the elevator and headed down to the lobby. Randolph returned to his station, and Roland left the hotel. To Randolph Probst, that first encounter with Roland T. Owen must have seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. Sure, Roland only had a few things on him which was unusual, but he was cordial and acted like any other hotel guest. But over the next 48 hours, Roland's presence would bring about some of the strangest occurrences the hotel had ever seen, and it would end as one of the most bizarre unsolved mysteries in Kansas City history. From Black Barrel Media, this is Infamous America. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this season is a shortened season that will feature 3 infamous mysteries that have kept people guessing for decades. This is episode 1, Roland Owen, room 1046. Like many major American cities, Kansas City was no stranger to crime or corruption. Kansas City quickly became a booming metropolitan area thanks to its strategic position along the Missouri River. The bustling city drew in all sorts of people who were looking to make a quick buck, including corrupt politicians and gangsters. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the city was dominated by the political machine of Tom Pendergast, who tipped the scales of just about every election in town. Meanwhile, Johnny Latzia, the head of the Kansas City crime family, flooded the city with illegal booze during Prohibition. But the city's share of violence and bloodshed wasn't reserved to just the mafia. In June 1933, a gang of bank robbers attempted to free an imprisoned friend. Police tried to stop them. Their effort resulted in one of the deadliest shootouts of the Great Depression, an event known as the Kansas City Massacre. But by the end of 1934, many of the most high-profile criminals of the era were out of action. Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly were in prison. Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson were all dead. Going into 1935, it seemed like the people of Kansas City might finally have some peace and quiet. Little did the people of Kansas City know that they were about to witness a mystery that would be talked about for generations. The President Hotel, known today as the Hilton President, was built in the mid-1920s, and it quickly became a popular destination. In 1928, Republicans held their national convention there and selected Herbert Hoover as their nominee. The hotel's lounge, known as the Drum Room, became a popular spot for performers like Benny Goodman and Frank Sinatra. When it opened, the square-shaped President Hotel contained approximately 435 rooms, with rooms facing the streets and the hotel's interior courtyard. On January 2, 1935, a man named Roland T. Owen walked into one of the interior rooms, room 1046. There was nothing particularly special about room 1046. When Randolph Probst showed it to Roland, Roland saw it was like any other room. From the entryway, there was a bathroom on the left and a closet on the right. In the living space, there was a writing desk, 2 chairs, a dresser, and a telephone, in addition to the bed. It was all standard for the time. Once Roland was situated, he and Randolph returned to the lobby. Randolph went back to his station and waited for the next guest who needed help. Roland left the hotel, and his activities are unknown. Later that afternoon, Mary Soptic, a hotel maid, went to room 1046 to do some cleaning, but she didn't know it had been rented to a new customer. Mary knocked on the door and was startled when Roland greeted her. Mary collected herself and told Roland that she could come back later. But Roland said Mary could go ahead and clean around him. When Mary entered the room, she was puzzled by how dark it was. She noticed the curtains were completely closed, and the only source of light was from a dull desk lamp. As Mary cleaned, she noticed that Roland acted a bit odd. She said later, quote, "He was either worried about something or afraid." At one point, Roland told Mary that he had to step out for a bit. He told her not to lock the door because he was expecting a friend. Roland left the room, and Mary left a short while later. Around 4 p.m., Mary returned to room 1046 with fresh towels. When she got to the door, she discovered it was unlocked. She went inside, and to her surprise, she found Roland lying on the bed, completely in the dark. It isn't clear if they exchanged words, but Mary noticed a note on the desk. It read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." That was the last interaction anyone from the hotel had with Roland that evening. The next morning, Mary Soptic was sent to clean room 1046 again. When she arrived, she found the door locked. That is, the door knob didn't turn. In Mary's mind, that indicated Roland was not in the room. The locks on the hotel doors were confusing. Apparently, when someone locked the door from the outside, they locked the door knob itself. When someone locked the door from the inside, they locked it with a deadbolt, which left the doorknob functional. When Mary tried to turn the doorknob and it didn't move, she knew it had been locked from the outside, and she believed the room was empty. She used her maid's passkey to unlock the door, and she stepped inside. To her shock, she found Roland Owen sitting alone in the dark. But that didn't make sense. The only way to lock the doorknob was from the outside. Someone had imprisoned Roland. And that was just the beginning of an increasingly weird and unexplainable 24 hours. It was around 10:30 a.m. on January 3rd when Mary Soptic entered room 1046 and discovered Roland T. Owen in the dark. No sooner had Mary entered than the telephone rang. Roland answered and listened to the person on the other end. Then Roland responded, "No, Don, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast." Mary watched as Roland spoke to the man he called Don. Roland became more agitated and repeated, "No, I'm not hungry." Then it appeared as though Roland was done with the call, but he didn't hang up the phone. He held it in his hand as he started asking Mary questions about being a maid for the hotel, and if the hotel had residential accommodations, and other things. Mary was confused. She grabbed the dirty towels and made another quick exit. At around 4:30 that afternoon, Mary returned to room 1046 once again, the fourth time in 24 hours. Like she had the previous afternoon, Mary brought fresh towels. When she approached the door, she paused. She heard muffled voices coming from the room. It sounded like two men were talking. Mary knocked on the door, and the voices went quiet. Then a harsh voice called out, "Who is it?" Mary identified herself and said she was there to replace the towels. The harsh voice responded, "We don't need any towels." Mary thought the response was odd because she knew they did need towels. She had taken the old ones 6 hours earlier. It isn't clear who Mary spoke to on the other side of the door. It could have been Roland, it could have been the mysterious Don, or it could have been someone else. And there are gaps in the story at that point. Based on the tense interaction, it's unlikely that Mary went into the room. She probably left the towels in the hall outside the door and continued with her work for the rest of the afternoon. Like the previous day, no one else from the hotel saw or interacted with Roland for the rest of the evening. If there was a second person in Roland's room, no one knew anything about the individual. At about 7 a.m. the next morning, a hotel telephone operator named Della Ferguson noticed something strange. The phone in room 1046 was off the hook. But the guest in room 1046 had not asked Della to connect a call and was not currently talking to anyone. 10 minutes later, she saw that it was still off the hook and showed no signs of being in use. So she informed the front desk. The front desk sent Randolph Probst the bellhop to inspect. When Randolph arrived, he discovered the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. When he tried opening the door, it was locked. He knocked and knocked and knocked. Finally, a voice on the other side of the door told Randolph to enter. But Randolph didn't have a pass key. He became frustrated and yelled for Roland to put the phone back on the hook. Then he went back downstairs. About an hour later, Della Ferguson saw that room 1046's phone was still off the hook. This time, the front desk sent Harold Pike, another bellhop, to deal with the situation. When Harold knocked on the door, no one responded. Unlike Randolph, Harold did have a pass key, and he let himself into the room. The room was dark except for a dim light off to one side. But in the murky darkness, Harold could see Roland in bed, naked. Harold also saw that the nightstand next to the bed where the phone was placed had been knocked over. Harold quickly fixed the stand and the telephone and placed the receiver back on the hook. Because it was dark, Harold didn't get the best look at Roland, but he did notice dark splotches on the bed sheets. Harold figured that Roland was probably drunk. And since the guest was naked and the phone was now back on the hook, Harold's job was done and he hustled back down to the lobby. Roughly 2.5 hours later, between 11 and 11:30 a.m., a different phone operator noticed that room 1046's phone was off the hook again. Randolph Probst journeyed back up to the 10th floor to deal with the increasingly difficult Roland T. Owen. When Randolph arrived, he saw the Do Not Disturb sign on the door, and with a sigh, he knocked loudly. This time, Randolph brought a pass key. When he received no response from Roland, Randolph used his key to let himself in the room. Once inside, he saw a scene that looked like it was from a modern horror movie. Randolph Probst entered room 1046 and gasped. He found Roland about 2 feet from the door on his hands and knees. Even in the semi-darkness, Randolph could see blood on Roland's head. When Randolph turned on the light, he saw blood everywhere. It painted the walls and the bed and the rest of Roland Owen. Randolph ran downstairs to the lobby and called for the police and a doctor. Then he and the hotel's assistant manager returned to room 1046. They tried to open the door, but it was a struggle. While Randolph had been away, Roland had moved and collapsed at the base of the door. Before long, investigators and a doctor arrived. They burst into the room with ease because Roland had moved again. They discovered Roland lying in the bathtub. It's not clear how he got there, given his gruesome injuries and restrictions, which were now on full display to everyone. Roland had been stabbed in the chest several times, which resulted in a punctured lung. He had gashes on his head and a fractured skull. But what was truly shocking and confusing was that he had a cord wrapped around his wrists, ankles, and neck. It was obvious that Roland had been tortured, and he was barely conscious as the police tried to help him. Investigators asked Roland who did this to him. Roland responded, quote, "Nobody. I fell against the bathtub." Roland also denied trying to take his own life. After those final words, he slipped into a coma. Emergency workers rushed him to a hospital, and now, with the room empty, investigators started trying to process the horrific scene. They scoured the room for clues, specifically weapons that could have been used to inflict the stab wounds and the skull fracture. But they found nothing. No knives or blunt objects that could have been used as bludgeons. As investigators looked closer, they realized they saw no clothes or hotel toiletries. The only clothing item in the room that belonged to Roland was a necktie. Someone had stolen Roland's things. Besides the tie, the only other items in the room were unsmoked cigarettes, a safety pin, a hairpin, and 2 water glasses. On one of the glasses, the police noticed a possible clue: a small fingerprint. Investigators believed that the fingerprint belonged to a woman. They checked the hotel's registry and made an interesting discovery. In room 1048, right next to Roland, there was a guest registered under the name Jean Owen, the same last name as Roland. The police found Jean and questioned her. She told them she had no idea who Roland was and that the last name was pure coincidence. She also told them that on the previous night, she heard lots of loud noises coming from the hallway. Specifically, she heard men and women talking loudly and cursing. But she never actually saw Roland, so the commotion could have come from anywhere on the floor. The police eventually found Jean's boyfriend, who backed up her account. A promising lead fizzled out quickly. Investigators contacted the Los Angeles Police Department, since Roland listed a Los Angeles address on his hotel registration. The LAPD searched but could not find a Roland T. Owen registered in the city. Kansas City investigators suspected the name Roland T. Owen was an alias, and their suspicions were confirmed fairly quickly. Detectives learned from the hotel staff at the President Hotel that Roland had stayed at another hotel in town, the Mulebach. When investigators went to the Mulebach, the hotel staff said no one by the name of Roland T. Owen had stayed with them. But the staff saw a photo of Roland, and someone did recognize him. According to the witness, the man now called Roland arrived at the Mulebach the night of January 1st and rented an interior room. But he didn't register as Roland T. Owen. He registered as Eugene K. Scott from Los Angeles. Kansas City detectives again reached out to the LAPD about Eugene K. Scott, and again, the LAPD found no one using that name. Eugene, like Roland, was clearly an alias. As investigators were even more puzzled by the true identity of the victim, they learned they were now dealing with a homicide. Roland Owen, or whoever he was, had survived the trip to the hospital in a coma, but he died the following morning, January 5th, 1935. As the identification dead ends and unanswered questions mounted, investigators hoped witnesses would come forward with possible leads. Roland's photo was printed in several local newspapers, and descriptions were cabled to various news wires. Beginning January 6th, people were allowed to view Roland's body in person with the hopes that someone may have seen him. As it turned out, lots of people interacted with him or claimed they knew him. On Sunday, January 6, 1935, the body of the mysterious man known as Roland T. Owen was displayed at a local funeral home. Between 50 and 300 people viewed the body, and tips and claims immediately poured in. One man, Ernest Johnson, saw the body and claimed it was his cousin Harvey. But Ernest's sister later said Harvey had been dead for 5 years. A wrestling promoter from Little Rock, Arkansas, said the body was a wrestler named Cecil Werner. The promoter said Cecil had recently asked about signing up for a few matches. The promoter also said Cecil had wrestled for a promoter named Charles Locke. But when Charles looked at the body, he didn't recognize the man at all. At the time, the best tip seemed to come from a water department worker named Robert Lane. According to Robert, he actually drove Roland around the city on the night of January 3rd. Robert said he encountered a man who looked like Roland at around 11 p.m. on 13th Street. As Robert was driving, he noticed the man running and shouting. But what really stuck out was the fact that the man was woefully underdressed for nighttime in the middle of winter in Kansas City. The man wore only pants, an undershirt, and shoes, so he must have been freezing. The man shouted for Robert to stop, and Robert did. But when the man approached Robert, the man realized he had made a mistake. The man thought Robert was driving a taxi. When the man understood his mistake, he asked Robert for a ride to the nearest cab stand. Robert felt sorry for the man and said okay. As the man hopped into the back seat, Robert heard the man say under his breath, quote, "I'll kill that expletive tomorrow." The expletive remains unknown because the only public report of the incident was in a newspaper which removed the offending word or words. Regardless, Robert became concerned and kept an eye on the man in his rear-view mirror. As Robert drove, he kept glancing at the man in the back seat. He saw that the man had cuts on his left arm and was holding his hands as if trying to prevent blood from pouring out. Before long, Robert arrived at a cab stand more than a mile from the President Hotel. The man bolted out of the car before Robert could stop, but the man thanked Robert for the ride. Robert watched as the man jumped into an empty taxi and honked the horn. With this spontaneous errand complete, Robert Lane drove away. Robert was convinced that the man he picked up was Roland Owen, but the police were skeptical and confused. If Robert Lane's story was true, then Roland had apparently threatened to kill someone no more than 12 hours before he was discovered badly injured. Could that someone be the mysterious man known as Don? If so, who was Don? How was he connected to Roland? And where was he now? It must have been maddening for detectives. Each time a new tip came in that seemed credible, it didn't add any usable information. It only added more questions. Over the next 2 months, detectives searched for Roland's real identity and for Don. All their efforts, including a request for help from the FBI, led nowhere. Finally, newspapers announced that the funeral home was going to bury Roland's body on March 3rd. Since no one had claimed him, he would be buried in a potter's field, or a cemetery for the unidentified. Investigators intended to discover Roland's real identity, but the time had come to lay him to rest. And that's when another bizarre twist happened. Before March 3rd, the funeral home received an anonymous call from a person who claimed to know Roland. The caller asked that Roland not be buried in the potter's field, but at a cemetery called Memorial Park. The caller would send money to pay for everything. When asked how the caller knew Roland, the response was, quote, "Owen didn't play the game fair. Cheaters usually get what's coming to them." Then the caller hung up. The funeral home opted to hold off on the burial. 3 weeks later, on March 23rd, they received an envelope filled with money to cover burial costs. Within a few days, the man known in Kansas City as Roland T. Owen was laid to rest. A bouquet of roses arrived and were placed at the grave. The roses came with a card that read, "Love forever, Louise." And yet again, with that tiny little note, detectives had more questions and no answers. Neither the phone call to the funeral home nor the flowers with the note were ever explained. For the next year and a half, detectives searched for anything that could put the bizarre case to rest, but they found nothing. Then, out of nowhere, in the fall of 1936, a woman called the Kansas City Police Department and claimed to be Roland's mother. Her name was Ruby Ogletree, and apparently her son had been communicating with her from beyond the grave. In May of 1935, 5 months after the murder, the American Weekly magazine published a story detailing the strange and mysterious death of Roland T. Owen. The story was a highly embellished version of events, but it did feature at least one photograph of Roland. A year and a half later, in the fall of 1936, a woman in Alabama picked up an old copy of the American Weekly, flipped it open, and read the story. When she saw the picture of Roland, she thought to herself, "That looks like Ruby Ogletree's son, Artemis." The friend showed Ruby the magazine photograph. When Ruby saw it, she knew that Roland was, in fact, her son Artemis. She contacted the Kansas City Police Department and claimed the body. In doing so, Ruby officially answered the central question of the case: who was Roland Owen? Roland Owen was Artemis Ogletree. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. According to Ruby, Artemis Ogletree was originally from Birmingham, Alabama, and the scar on his head that people noticed when he checked into the hotel was from a childhood accident involving hot grease. In April 1934, when Artemis was 17 years old, he decided to leave Birmingham and hitchhike across America. But he didn't go alone. He went with a friend named Joe Simpson. At some point in their travels, Artemis and Joe made it to Los Angeles, and for whatever reason, they decided to split up. Artemis wrote to Ruby often and kept her updated on his whereabouts, but he never explained why he and Joe parted ways. According to Ruby, Artemis was out of California and in Kansas City, a full 5 months before his death. Artemis had told her that he was staying at the St. Regis Hotel. Police followed up on the detail and discovered that he had registered there with a man named Don Kelso. In mid-January 1935, about 2 weeks after Artemis's brutal murder, Ruby began to think something was wrong, though of course she didn't know her son had been killed. Her concern grew out of a letter she had received that was attributed to Artemis. It said he was on his way to New York City, but the letter had been written with a typewriter. All of Artemis's previous letters were written by hand. When Artemis left home, he didn't know how to type. But that didn't mean he hadn't learned in the past 8 months or hadn't paid someone to type it for him. There were lots of possibilities that could account for the change, so Ruby shrugged it off. A few months later, Ruby received another letter attributed to Artemis. That one, also typewritten, said Artemis was on his way to France. Sometime later, she received a third typed letter from Artemis saying that he was now in Cairo, Egypt. At the same time, the police in Kansas City were investigating the murder of the man they knew as Roland Owen. Ruby was receiving letters that said Roland/Artemis was in France and then Egypt. And then the letters stopped. As the months of no communication continued, Ruby became worried. She wrote to the FBI and the American consulate in Cairo and asked for help. She appealed to President Franklin Roosevelt, writing, "I fear he has fallen into some gang, or something has happened to him. He has always been a good boy and has high ideals. I simply must find some trace of him. If he is in trouble, I want to know." She received no response, and deep down, she knew he was likely dead. It wasn't until the fall of 1936, when she learned of the death of Roland T. Owen in Kansas City, that her fears were confirmed. Her son Artemis had been murdered. But even with that knowledge, the mystery was far from solved. Investigators looked for Don Kelso, the man who had registered at the St. Regis Hotel with Artemis Ogletree. They found a man in Kansas City named Joseph Ogden, who had used Donald Kelso as an alias. It just so happened that Ogden allegedly strangled a man in Kansas City named Ogletree and wrote letters to the victim's mother. But when the FBI compared Joseph Ogden's handwriting to Don Kelso's handwriting from the St. Regis Hotel registry, they didn't match. At the time, that was enough to rule out Joseph Ogden as the killer. In Ruby's opinion, the obvious killer was her son's friend and traveling companion, Joe Simpson. According to Ruby, in August of 1935, she received a call from a man calling himself Godfrey Jordan, who was in Memphis, Tennessee. Godfrey told Ruby that he had met Artemis when they were in Cairo, and that Artemis had supposedly saved Godfrey from a gang of thieves. Ruby said the phone call lasted almost an hour, and when it ended, something felt off. The voice of the person who called himself Godfrey sounded familiar. After Artemis's death, Ruby tried to reach out to Joe Simpson, but couldn't find him. Finally, in December 1939, she managed to track him down. They met in person, and at one point during their conversation, Ruby said to Joe that she knew it was his voice on the call she had received from Memphis. According to Ruby, quote, "He turned red, dropped his eyes, and was nervous." For Ruby, Joe's reaction confirmed he was the killer. She would never know why Joe killed her son, if he did, but she was convinced. And since there was no evidence against Joe, the authorities couldn't do anything. In the years since, there have been no good answers to any of the long list of questions about the murder of Artemis Ogletree, the man known as Roland T. Owen, in room 1046 of the President Hotel. Much of the case remains an unsolved mystery. Next time on Infamous America, we jump forward 10 years to a case in West Virginia that seems like a tragic accident, but is filled with baffling twists and turns. When the Sauter family suffers a devastating house fire on Christmas Eve, 5 children are never seen again. Were they victims of the fire, or were they kidnapped, possibly by the mafia? That story is next week on Infamous America. Members of our Black Barrel Plus program don't have to wait week to week for new episodes. They receive the entire season to binge all at once with no commercials. And they also receive exclusive bonus episodes. Sign up now through the link in the show notes or on our website, blackbarrelmedia.com. This episode was researched and written by Joe Guerra. Original music by Rob Valier. I'm your host and producer, Chris Wimmer. Find us at our website, blackbarrelmedia.com, or on our social media channels. We're Black Barrel Media on Facebook and Instagram, and B Barrel Media on Twitter. and you can stream all our episodes on YouTube. Just search for Infamous America Podcast. Thanks for listening.